do you start? So where do you go to learn about this ecosystem that is full of jargon and acronyms and sometimes a lot more complicated than it needs to be? What constitutes a good working knowledge of this space, and how do you set yourself up for success and avoid having the wool pulled over your eyes? So my name is Olivia Minnick. I work for Embedded Services Specialist MMOB, and we have a great panel here with us this afternoon. So we have Jazz Shah from Bitzel, we have Sandra Meander from Paperwork, and we have Joe Samuel from Visa, who in the classic kind of live stream way is kind of having some problems logging in, but we're looking forward to hearing from Joe very soon. I'll be asking the questions today, but as we are live, please feel free to send in any questions, so comment them and we will make sure that we get through those as well, because we want to be as helpful to what you want to know as possible. So I'm just going to start by asking everyone to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their background and how they ended up in payments and cards. So Sandra, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Of course, fantastic. Thank you very much, Olivia. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. So I'm Sandra Meander from Paperwork. We are essentially a consultancy helping merchants making kind of sense precisely of what's happening in the industry, what's the best solution for them. Myself, in terms of my background, I've been in payment about 14 years, started straight up within tier one banking, Barclays, and sort of navigated my way from pure traditional payment processing, heavily targeted towards cards, to then exploring cross-border payment, APMs, a bit of POS, issuing side of things, before setting up my business about essentially a year ago. So I stumbled into payments.
Excellent. Didn't a lot of us as well. Jazz, yes. How about you? How did you end up here?
Yep. Hiya. I'm Jazz, founder of Bitzel, fintech-focused product consultancy. So I've been in fintech my entire career, which is longer than you would think, but I think it's probably about the past 5 or 6 years I've been a lot deeper in the kind of retail payment space. So when I graduated, I worked in investment banking. I spent 6 years in asset management. So in terms of payments, it was very much back office side of payments, but for the past 5 or 6 years I've been working on digital banking propositions, open banking payments, SME digital banks, SME lending services, and so have become deeply entrenched in the payment space.
So, but both of you have kind of come from backgrounds where you've worked in much larger organizations, then you've decided to go out and branch out and found your own business. So what's the difference, I guess? How do you stay on top of making sure you're learning about the latest innovations in the industry when you're very much now sort of working for yourself and having to do all that as well?
So I think...
Sorry, go on, Sandra, after you.
I was going to say, I think me and Jazz would have probably a lot of synergy in terms of precisely that. I feel that I'm very fortunate in my position today because precisely I can make a focus on learning. The more I'm educated, the more value I can drive to clients, right? Because that's my job, to actually get to speak, to understand who is who, what's happening in the market, what else is coming up. A merchant, essentially merchant banks, fintech, what they want is essentially to run their business, right? And as part of the business, there's a payment component, right? So it's extremely difficult unless you are like that passionate and just want to learn about payment in your spare time. It's a whole different approach. So I do actually really dedicate time. It's part of the work, the value of the work, to research, to attend webinars, to speak to people, to network, to do forums like this, because a lot of the learning comes from the questions back, right? So we've got, of course, exposure through the work that we do through very specific, projects, but then hearing from feedback from, conversation like this, other perspective, that for me, it's a huge opportunity for growth, for learning.
Excellent. Jazz, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. It's a lot of kind of ongoing reading. I personally think that loads of people learn in various different ways. So for visual learners, I think they would benefit from looking at Sandra and Paperwork, because it's very much a kind of shows the whole landscape, and then there's information behind it. But some people learn very visually and they can absorb things very quickly through images, and some people like to kind of read. I think probably the one thing that's not the one area where I don't learn that best is, especially in the payment spaces, like podcasts and listening to stuff, because it's very difficult to, especially such a kind of technically complex space such as payments and cards, to visualize things just through listening. So it's kind of having that writing and imagery, and then probably some voiceover is the perfect combo for me. But yeah, lots of reading, again, lots of networking. I also try and write quite a bit, and so I learn through coming up with a topic, writing about it, and then kind of just using that like a headline as a way of learning everything in depth about the subject.
So funny you saying that, just because that's, my frustration built up precisely like that, because say working through projects, I used to keep a notebook, and I would always write down anything that I'm stumbling across, and it's really interesting. And then that builds up to become a repertory of different things. And unless you dedicate the time and decide, okay, I'm going to spend an hour, 2 hours, like you said, researching, reading, that just becomes like capturing jargons, information, and then it's just a nice collection of terms, but nothing with it. And really, that was my push to kind of like, okay, like exactly as you do, Chas, I just have a lot of things that I just take on the way, talking with people on the bus or whatever. And that's kind of prompting, oh, actually, I wonder about this, and start researching, and sometimes even building content around it, right? Because not every, today we, of course, in a good, I would say, a place where there's a reasonably good content, a lot of content out there, but there's also a lot of non-existing content that just exists in people's brain, right? People that are extremely knowledgeable, extremely insightful, but that never come out in an article, in a blog post or anything. And that's really, I suppose, the difficulty, right? There's a lot of knowledge, but how do you bring this into a way that people can digest it and it can actually be socialized, right?
Absolutely. And we've had a comment come in saying, it doesn't have to be one way or the other. This is a multi-channel world. So getting info in multi-formats is the key to stickiness. And that's so true. And it goes back to what we've said about people learning in different ways. Some people might be visual. Some people might want to listen to something or read. I'm a recovering editor, as many people know. So I have done a lot of kind of copywriting projects where you just get sent, can you write this about the Forex landscape or what, something that you've never done before? And you'll be surprised if there's a deadline the next day. You have to learn about it because you have to write that and submit it and do that research. So it motivates you quite a lot as well. What do we think are some of the main barriers and concerns? What are the kind of not barriers but challenges around this, in terms of, is it regulations, technical complexity? What are people most afraid of when they think about learning about this environment?
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of people necessarily. I don't think that there are necessarily that many barriers, because lots of the rails that payments use, or the different payment rails that are out there, are very public. So you could, if you were technically minded, which I'm a reformed engineer, you could go read the APIs and you could understand exactly how the payment rails work. But that is kind of one facet of the thing you're learning about. So when I look at payments, and even coming into this discussion, I was thinking, well, why is it so complex? And it's because it's really broad in terms of the different payment rails you've got. If we just talk about the UK, Swift, CHAPS, account to account, SEPA, the debit and credit card rails, just to name some of them. And that's kind of the breadth of UK, let's say. Then you've got the depth of it, which is, knowing it to a regulatory extent, or knowing it to a technical extent, or knowing it to an economic benefit extent, or a consumer benefit extent, which is kind of where I try and position myself. So I think it's because it's really broad and it can go really deep. So I think that's the landscape is so big that I think maybe if we're saying that something that's a barrier, it's just so overwhelming initially to look at it and go, well, where do I start? Like I could jump into open banking payments to start looking at open banking payments first, or I could look at account to Swift payments, or I could look at faster payments network. It's just so broad and it's so kind of deep that it's difficult to know where to start, I think.
Yeah. I'd agree completely with that. I mean, overwhelming is probably an understatement to depict what it is, for sure, to dive into that. And I think for me, the two additional points that I add to that is first, there's a context as well, right? Because there's the learning, but then that learning apply to certain project, to certain segment. And when you add, besides everything that you've already said, Jazz, that literally can throw people off because you may as well learn understand payment, but what you come to learn might be very relevant or very pertinent in that segment. And then when you apply this, like say from a retail to an airline, the dynamic are completely different. The approach in terms of what is the value driven and where, what's the legacy framework that you're starting on, completely different, right? So all of these adds on. And then you've got a fast-paced evolution that can be dictated by the regulatory environment, that can be compliance, that can be consumer-led. And then you're like, okay, it's like, rat race.
And it strikes me that having, with that deep knowledge, having different people to call on is quite important for that, I suppose, being able to go to someone and say, actually, I'm not an expert on this part of regulation. Can you help me with that? And it's quite obvious how one would do that in a large organization. And if Joe's Wi-Fi ever comes up, I'm sure we can talk to him about Visa. But in terms of yourselves now being a lot more independent, how do you go about making sure that you've got people to support you with that knowledge and that you can ask people those questions? I mean, Jazz, maybe I'll start with you. Have you kind of developed a big network, or what do you tend to do?
I mean, I've developed a reasonably biggish network just through kind of working with people and working on projects where I'm not a compliance expert. You pick up some of that broad knowledge, like, okay, well, I know I need regulation to do these types of payments, but I don't know what the process is to go for regulatory approval, let's say, or filling out a regulatory application doc. So I built a network of people up from that aspect. But I think it's surprising how you can just reach out to someone and ask them a question on LinkedIn, let's say, and they will, if you reach out to four or five or six different people, someone will usually respond just out of courtesy. So you can reach out and kind of expand your network by asking people questions that if you think they're an expert in the space. But yeah, lots of my network has been grown from working on kind of broad and interesting projects, and then just kind of picking up people on the way and going, yeah, I've worked with them, they're brilliant, there's a viral question. And I think it's a two-way street, isn't it? It's like pay it forward. So I'm very open with, like, people ask me questions, I'm just like, yeah, I have to give up 15 minutes to chat about one payment method over another in the application of building a challenger bank, and often that will come back around, and 2 years later I'll have a question for someone, and they'll be open to doing it, because it's just the fintech community is very reciprocal in that respect.
Yeah, and I think it's evolved. Probably, I don't know if the COVID situation, the fact that you had less of that face-to-face going and meeting people has kind of like opened up more people to, like you say, share more openly in that kind of very informal environment where you probably don't know the person. I get that all the time, where a contact or connections introduce me to someone because they know that person has a project. So I think there's definitely a shift in terms of how we've just come to realize that, when you've got constraint where you can't just go and meet a person, have meetings like in a more conducive way than virtually. Finally, social media can become a really, really great tool. And, for me, it has completely opened up and certainly driven that knowledge, because where do you read open source, you read what people write on blogs, you read articles, you attend podcasts, etc. But then there are people that you've worked with on projects and you've seen how they deliver, and what they deliver is just literally like a bit just based on that project. And so you kind of lean towards them as a first instance, and then they open up the other network. Like naturally, a marketer would have a more marketing-based, type of connections, like a commercial, a product manager, etc. So when you have kind of like some of those initial, connections within your network, they then open up to their other wider network, and that just literally, gives you access to a pool of insightful brains. I like to call it like that.
Definitely. And yeah, I completely agree with that, as someone who's been quite early on in my career, being able to just reach out to people you're surprised initially when they say, yeah, I'll take, half an hour and I'll explain this to you. But I guess logically, if you think about it, if someone reached out to you and said, you're such an expert, please, can you help me? You'd be like, yeah, okay, yeah, I'll help. You're kind of happy to do that.
Flattery works, doesn't it, sometimes?
Exactly. It does on me anyway. But in terms of the open source and we've had a comment as well around crowdsourcing that information. I'd be interested to know how both of you you've touched on this a little bit, how you ascertain what is kind of quality and reliable information. Because I think one thing that worries me now is that people can, put up a blog post or put in a LinkedIn post.
Oh, yes.
And if you don't have that experience, you'll just read it and take that on board. Is there anything that you do apart from kind of relying on people that you've worked with before to kind of ascertain whether that information is good or not?
I was going to say, out of all of us here, you're probably the expert on that in terms of verify your sources, cross-check stuff. I think the past, I don't want to turn it into a Silicon Valley Bank discussion, but I think the past couple of weeks, lots of people have written explainers why it happened, or what happened here. Oh, this is exactly why, like their own, to an extent, opinion of what it looks like, and then you've had other people call them out and say, no, this isn't right. And I think it's just absorb the source, but cross-check it as well. So with all of the kind of research I'll do and explains I'll put together, I'll make sure I know it inside out, because I know that there's a responsibility.
Yes.
But if I'm writing something and publishing it, if it's wrong, that could go to 100, 200, 300 people, and they could take that as gospel and think, oh my god, this is amazing, this is how we should do this. And if it's wrong, they do it incorrectly, it's kind of on me as well, because they lose the trust with what I'm producing, or the experience I'm giving them.
I think that question, Olivia, for me, it's probably one of the biggest challenge, right? Because today we live in, this kind of context where there's a lot of information. Great. We cannot get access to a lot of different topics, etc. But then starting to validate, and it's not so much kind of like the source by, say, how long a company has been established or who they stand in the market. There's also like new players, very niche, that actually develop something, and they've worked on this, like startup level for, I don't know, years and years. They may have probably a much closer, perspective than kind of relying on sources that are coming from a large, big player that's been established, that don't actually necessarily spend or invest into researching and doing blogs, right? So that balance for me, I certainly feel that it is quite a challenge. And partially, to the point that you were making, Jazz, taking responsibility, you're right, because it's not just about putting content for putting content out there. For me, there's always a purpose of having that reciprocal kind of engagement with the community out there, because I do believe that everybody's got a level of expertise, but nobody's got necessarily all of it covered, right? So I take my responsibility to say, this is as much as I know, right? And actually, one of my hashtag is tag the expert when I put something out there, because I want to be upfront to say, this is the perspective of what I'm understanding. And I'm understanding it maybe because I worked on the retail project, on an airline project, on the fintech project, and that meant that in that context. But I'm also very much aware that it could be different use case interpretation to that. Hence, come and share. Let's kind of reciprocate that, right? Because we want to share, we want to help the community, but it works two ways. I think we're all hungry for that information, knowledge, and it's a constant, kind of finding, double checking, looking at different sources, and not just invalidating things because it's coming from a smaller unknown blog or person that is not necessarily prominent or doesn't have that many followers, because there's many knowledgeable people, but not everybody's comfortable putting their insight out there, right?
Yeah, I think I would kind of conclude three key things I would always do from what you've both just said. So I think the first thing is obviously looking at that variety of sources and not just kind of looking at one, and taking that information in and seeing where things maybe differ and where they're similar. The second one would be what journalists always say, which is follow the money. So why has this person put this knowledge out there? Is the conclusion you should then use my consultancy or buy my product or whatever, which sometimes doesn't mean the information isn't true, but sometimes it can definitely change things. And the third thing I would say is, I guess, think about what they're not commenting on. So something like with Silicon Valley Bank, you know, the sources I would trust are people saying, here's what I know about, here's the parts I don't know about, go to someone else for that. And to me, that really makes them seem a lot more credible, because they're saying, as you say, tag the expert in this part. I'm not going to pretend that I know, which is really good. Joe, you've appeared. You made it in.
I did. Sorry about that. Our Visa network does not like this link, so I apologize.
No problem. That's a very, very standard thing to happen on these kind of live streams, but it's great to have you here. We've just been discussing a little bit about Jazz and Sandra's kind of careers in payments and how they got to where they are now, and a little bit about how they learn and continue to keep up with cards and payments. So Joe, it'd be great to hear from you. You know, how did you end up in this kind of sector and industry and in your role at Visa?
So quickly, thank you. Quickly, I will I will happily chat about that for a few seconds. So I've been at Visa a little over 6 years, but I started in the payments industry a little over 20 years ago. I was in the tech sector before that, and I'd heard about a particular company that ultimately I went to 20 plus years ago in the payments industry. I'd heard about them, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And when I was in the tech sector and working for a web hosting company, and in the United States, as I'm American, as you can tell, and so you know we had our IPO, initial public offering, and all that was great. Everyone was happy, and then of course the bottom fell out, and then so I was like, okay, where am I going to go next? And I was like, oh yeah, I remember talking to some people in payments. What is that? So I went to talk with them. They're like, hey, you know, would you like to work here? And so that's how I ended up starting. And believe it or not, I actually started in the money transmitter world. I worked at First Data for a long time. And at the time they owned Western Union. So I started doing some work to support Western Union, and then flipped over to the card side of the world. But that's how I got into it, almost by happenstance. But when I look back, I'm like, oh, it's easy to make the transition from tech to payments, and now it's converging, right? It's converged, right? So in many instances. So when I look back on it now, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But at the time I was like, huh, how did I get over here? But that's a little bit about my story.
That's great. That really resonates. I think it's similar to things that Jazz and Sandra said. I think sometimes we think we have this kind of strange career path that is quite squiggly, but actually it all makes sense when you look back and you think about all those skills you've learned. We've also just been talking a little bit about keeping up to date with what's changing in payments and making sure we keep up to date with the latest knowledge. I guess it'd be interesting to hear from you, Joe. You know, at an organization, the scale of Visa, is there anything Visa does to kind of keep people educated and at the cutting edge? And is that a challenge in such a big organization to do that culturally?
It is. Visa's great about curiosity, and so we have lots of different vehicles to continue our learning, and we're always encouraged to learn, which I encourage my team to learn. We're always encouraged, which is fantastic. The payments industry is so broad and so deep. I personally at least feel like, I don't know about others, but I feel like one can never know it all. I don't think anyone can ever understand every aspect of payments. There's carded payments, there's non-card rails, retail payments, corporate payments, just general business payments, things. There's so much, and every aspect of that is so in depth, and there are multiple participants. And all those multiple participants have different points of view, and each action doesn't necessarily equate to an equal or opposite reaction, right? So the different permutations of things that happen. So I think it's an industry where if you love to learn, this is a great place to be. Because I don't know how people can actually get bored. You may stay in a particular vertical and get to really know that aspect. That's one thing. But again, to learn all aspects of everything, I feel like it's a challenge to continually learn something new every day, because there's always something new to learn every day, and I'm always like, okay, what don't I know? Or someone will say something to me, well, what about this? And I'm like, oh gosh, I've got to learn about that. Like you cannot get bored in this industry. I promise you, it's impossible.
And I want to kind of talk to you all about, I guess, the world of carded payments being, you know, a very highly sort of responsible area to be in. I guess, you know, this is people's money we're talking about. This isn't something that we can just, oh, you know, we made a mistake, we got it wrong, and no one will mind. So how do you balance, you know, being able to learn and give people the opportunity to try different things and make mistakes, as we all want to do in fintech, but also kind of remembering that this is really important and we need to look after people's money and keep it safe? So does anyone have any thoughts on how that is currently balanced?
I mean, I guess regulators to a certain degree have that gatekeeping responsibility, so you're not putting things out there that are not that are irresponsible. And I guess this is where, you know, you start getting into the buy now pay later and crypto space, where there is, you know, there's not as much regulation as people want, and there is that risk of you know, potentially not understanding the process and maybe losing money. But yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, to a degree, you know, everyone has responsibility to build products and launch things and give things to consumers in a responsible way, but not everyone does that. So you have to have checks and balances, and usually that is the regulator. But then, you know, often, you know, regulators will also, there's so much stuff to regulate at the moment. There's, you know, fintechs popping up every single day, so it's difficult to regulate everything. But I would say it's everyone's responsibility, but the gatekeeper should be, you know, regional regulators.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to also add the operational spin to that, because yes, ultimately, the ultimate safeguard is compliance, the regulatory, but then there's also, you know, essentially not building it correctly, a product, or not necessarily having providers that abide by the same due diligence process, etc. So there's also that essentially factored into ultimately your product, your delivery. But at the same time, there's a lot of test and learn, because you know, we are today definitely in a context where there's more use cases, more relevance, more value. So we're going into new territories, and the BNPL example is a great one, right? It just started like this different way, frictionless, getting access to more things. Fast forward a few years later, and it becomes like, how did that even come to market without even having some form of regulatory governance around this is a credit product, and why it is not governed in that same way? So that test and learn is inevitable because of the pace at which we're going, and we are driven by experience, use case, innovation, and it doesn't always sit well with safeguarding and, you know, all of, you know, the nice framework that we would want to put on things. So yeah, there's an operational element failure that I think is sometimes not necessarily, you know, easy to to kind of preempt, right? It's learning on the go.
And I would say, while I fully agree that you know, regulators have a role, I also believe it's incumbent upon the ecosystem, because at the end of the day, without trust, there's no, you know, at least from a card rails perspective, or even non-card rails, like, you know, people need to get their money, right? Humans need to get their money, and to pay someone or to be paid, right? And without trust in the system, then people will find another way. And so I think it's incumbent upon us. And when I think about at least the carded space, you've got the scheme. So whether it's an Amex or here Visa or MasterCard or Discover or Cup or China Union Pay or whomever, I think there's a strong motivation and a strong sense of responsibility that we have to protect the ecosystem, get the bad guys out, ensure that the bad guys stay out, so that there is trust, so that people will continue to use these rails for other use cases. Because again, without that, people will look for other alternatives.
Okay. And what do you all think are some of the common, I I guess, misunderstandings or misconceptions when it comes to the areas that you specialize in? Is there anything that you feel consistently people aren't getting or getting wrong, apart from the fact that it's obviously a lot more complicated than it looks on the surface? Is there anything else there?
For me, I would say something that's really struck me a lot more during my corporate years before being independent was the assumptions, right? So you learn something years back, and then you don't evolve that thinking, and you're just assuming and continuing to lead projects with assumptions or understanding that you're not necessarily refreshing. But also, as you said, it's whatever whichever way you're looking at payment, there's always many different stakeholders, whether it's from the actual delivery of the project or even the stakeholders that are involved in that project. And so you rely on each of these parties to be expert in their own right in the segment that they play into that ecosystem. And I've been quite surprised that as an assumption can lead a project to just go wrong. Right? So for me, being inquisitive and not being afraid, because you're coming from a product standpoint, you're coming from a commercial standpoint, you're coming from a legal standpoint, just realigning that before we move further and we keep adding the layers to build that, are we just all understanding it like this? Is there an element that is not actually being taken in consideration in the way we're approaching that? That for me was almost revelation, just to stop and to put that on the table. You'd be surprised how many people would then almost take that as a breather, like, oh yeah, actually, I'm glad you asked the question because I'm not sure or whatever. So that assumption that everybody understand by doing that assumption, you assume that they understand your part. No, not necessarily, right? So we all have certain remit and we can be convoluted because we do certain things days in and out in a certain segment. And then when you come all together and you're building something, going is this assumption, it's essentially how you can go wrong. And then, yeah, that's perspective.
I think those are great points, and I would agree. And also I'd like, again, to be parochial here, but one of the things that I find rather humorous is at least when it comes to Visa and MasterCard, people say, oh, the credit card company. And I always laugh because I'm like, well, we're a lot more than that. And so I find that sort of humorous. The other thing I do think is interesting is in terms of misconceptions or misunderstandings. It's just on the part of consumers, because I can tell you, whether it's my 85-year-old parents or whomever will constantly say, hey, jokingly, hey, can you up my credit limit? And right, assuming that's what Visa, is card schemes, that's what we do. There's no concept that there's a bank and they've got the card from the bank and the bank manages the credit. Like, it's those sorts of things. Like, because the things work so simply and so beautifully, for the most part, so seamlessly, people just make these assumptions. And the last one I was going to say was just said earlier, which was, I do think that it's important that it's easy to just assume what I learned in the industry 10 years ago is still relevant today. Some things may be, but many things aren't. Many things are evolving quickly, and I think that's a risk that we'll have to watch out for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Jazz, do you have anything you'd add to that?
I was going to say nothing. I mean, nothing to add really. I guess going back to Sandra's point as well. I guess the consumer education when it comes to finance is another Pandora's box to a degree, because I'd say that not everyone in fintech or payments even knows how all of this stuff works. So I think it's almost impossible to try and translate that to giving consumers knowledge. But I think there needs to be that education exercise. Mm-hmm. And at some point, people will have to know how, when they go pay for stuff at a merchant and they're buying £10 worth of goods, that not all that money's going to the merchant, that some of that money goes to another bank, goes to the merchant's bank as a fee, goes to the rails as a percentage and as a monthly fee. And I don't think everyone, to be honest, I think probably 95% of people who go in and pay for stuff don't know that. Mm-hmm. And I think if more people know that, maybe it would change, the usage and payment methods that they would use in store. For example, if you go to a small shop, traditionally they've been, explicit fees that say minimum £5 on card, £10 if it's American Express, because American Express fees are higher. That most people still don't really get. Oh, why is it so expensive? Oh, it's because, I don't know, they want to use cash because they want to launder money. No, not true. It's not true. It's because it's more expensive to manage that process. And for the merchant, they take a hit when someone uses card, but card has less friction now, and obviously debit payments, contactless payments are going up, so merchants have to do that. But I think consumer education would start to kind of inform people more and make payment rail choices more on the consumer versus the person building the product, for example.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting what you've mentioned about, because the experiences are so seamless on the consumer side, there's so many layers involved now in all these transactions that people don't realize. And I think that can sometimes damage trust. I've had an experience where, I've transferred my friend some money from a challenger bank, and then they've said, oh, something's come up about TrueLayer or something like that. I don't know what that is. That's obviously a scam, or, things like that, because they haven't understood how it all works. And whilst some of the apps we have now for saving and investing, for example, might be a savings app, but your money is actually saved away in a bank, and that's backed by a regulated bank. For me, that's reassuring. But for some people, they're kind of saying, well, hang on, where is my money then? If I think I'm dealing with this business, but there's actually someone else behind the scenes, it can be quite difficult, I think.
Yeah. Just to jump in, Olivia, I think going back to Sandra's point as well, marketing has involvement in that process. Product have a big role to play in making sure that the journey is explained and understood by the consumer, especially if it's a consumer facing proposition. And so lots of that frictions sometimes stem from even the people building it not necessarily fully knowing what the journey is supposed to be and what the consumer is going to see, and maybe explaining that sometimes gets lost in translation. But I guess if you explain something to a consumer and they fully understand it, there's not, like, for example, Monzo early days when you'd open a savings account, but it's actually an Oak North Bank savings account. Mm-hmm. The journey was pretty seamless. They explained it fully. They said, we're transferring you to this. This is transferring you to Oak North. This is where your savings is going to sit. You can manage it and see it through Monzo, but it's essentially all your funds are stored with Oak North, so that's where your savings are going to sit. Clear. There's no, there was a little bit of friction, I guess, but as long as you explain it, it's not, it's not scary when Oak North pops up in your email and they're telling you they're changing a rate. You're like you said, well, what's Oak North? Or what's TrueLayer?
Exactly. I think that's where, so with MMOB, we deal with embedded services, and I think sometimes there is a preferred amount of slight friction where they just want to see something come up. Instead of having something totally white labeled within an app, they might want to say, yeah, we're now taking you over to this brand, and this is what's happening. And, it doesn't need to cause a delay or a huge amount of friction, but it's just enough for someone to understand what's happening to their data and what's happening to their money as well.
That's so interesting what you're saying. The point you essentially making around, from one hand, the education from the consumer, because a lot of the things that are being built are essentially being built because it's consumer driving it, right? It's like the shift, that's how they want. We talk a lot about friction less. And you're right. It's so interesting to see that there's been some models, so say the whole invisible payment experience where you would come, say in an Amazon, whatever shop, and you literally come and grab anything and go out and don't interact with your card. Great from a seamless, UX. Excellent, but the consumer is completely confused. So you need to reinsert friction because you worry them. What's happening with my payment? So you now have my card, so you can just literally charge anything. It's, it's kind of really finding the balance between, you're right, the education and the seamless, frictionless, but friction can be necessary. And we are seeing it a lot more because of these almost friction, like invisible payment experience. Consumers are not ready for that. So we need friction.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess as a business behind the scenes, sometimes you do want the customers or whoever you're dealing with to know it was you. You don't want to be totally hidden away. And And that I think brings us to what we've just said around to kind of financial education generally for both consumers knowing about their finances, but also people who might want to come in and work in fintech and in payments. I often find it interesting. I ask a lot of people this question. For example, when we talk about buy now, pay later, and a lot of the buy now, pay later companies will say, yeah, well, it should be schools. And a lot of educators will say, well, it should be the apps that are educating people. And someone will say it should be the government might say it should be the industry. Everyone seems to pass that around quite a lot. So where do we think the responsibility is around educating people, right from young people in school to adults about their finances and about fintech as well?
Yeah, I would say that it starts with the schools because, not everyone is necessarily going to have a specific app where they can learn, and therefore that learning isn't standardized. And then you can't go through that learning journey where you learn the foundation building blocks and then move up and up and up and up and up. So I would say it has to start in schools. But I don't think we've ever seen. I don't have kids, so I don't know if this is the case now. But I have never seen a financial literacy course in schools, or even I think up until 16, you have to kind of elect to do that extra stuff and extra learning. So I would say it has to start in primary school. And I'm not talking about mathematics, which is mandatory anyway. I'm talking that extra bit where saving, what's saving, what is an interest rate, all of this stuff that is fundamental when you grow up and day-to-day life, and what are taxes and where do they, what are the reasons for tax, all that kind of stuff. I think it has to start base level and it has to be driven by syllabus. And then we can talk about financial savings apps. There's loads of PFM apps on the market now who connect open banking connections, and they give you insights, but they also give you a newsletter every week. They tell you what's happening with, okay, the budget's doing this is what it means, what interest rate changes means, all of those different things. But I think the baseline has to be in schools, because that's kind of where everyone starts learning the basics of like maths, English, and all that.
And for me, from the perspective of having kids, completely agree, because of course my kids have got, I guess, a very different take into payments, because they see their mom literally, dealing with payments, stocking payments, putting videos around payments and stuff, and they're picking an interest because of my approach, visual, the way I'm doing things. I'm also drawn to content that graphically explain, even if it's a video explainer, right? So if I put something up, they pick an interest because it's actually explained in a way that is captivating even at that level. And you're right, some of the jargons, whether you're talking about what's a transaction, what's debt, what's credit, it's so early on, and certainly the kids of this generation, they are handling money, or certainly dealing to a certain extent with money much early on, even on the gamification side of things, right? They play games and all of a sudden they see some pop-ups they don't really understand. It means, okay, maybe I see mom's card there, let me just quickly put that in, right? So it's not that early, right? Maybe even 4 years old. So I think 100% in school, some of the really high level, basis around the economy, how things work, transaction, and we're living through really important crises. If anything, I think it's increasingly important to add the aspect of managing money, understanding how the economy works. We've got banks, we've got interest rates. You live in the house, you purchase it outright, you use a loan or whatever. It can start so early on, because we have a generation of kids that are living already into environments where they're prompted into acting with payments through games, right? And that starts that early, that if they can play and they understand what it means to buy a skin, then you probably want to make sure they understand the implication of payments, debt, etc., etc. So yeah, that's a starting point. Now, where does that need to be regulated, managed, whether there's a body that should essentially oversee the whole thing? It's really funny because, here at this event, MP, Merchant Payment Ecosystem in Berlin, I just met a girl that was telling me she's doing a PhD in fintech. My jaw dropped. I was like, is there such a thing? Are we up to the level where there is a PhD in fintech? That literally took me by surprise. And I wanted to understand, where does that lead you? There's a balance between understanding concept, understanding some, fundamentals that are essentially still relevant today and will be relevant tomorrow, because a lot of the innovations are being built through some of this foundation infrastructure that then gets, additional technology that makes some of the, use case, easier or more agile. So for me, it's really important, the actual relevant and operational use of what we're talking payments and use case. It's difficult to get that through going through, I don't know, 6 years fintech study or master or whatever. The real life experience will always prevail, right? I mean, a lot of us, and I'm pretty sure, have learned on the jobs. And that just goes to show, it is that fast moving, that's, complex foundations, yes, but it's a real life thing. You need to be exposed, you need to follow that journey as it unfolds. I feel it's going to be difficult to, it's not like law or, I don't know, being a doctor. Yeah, I feel it's probably not something that you can really box into a rigid education system or body or accreditation.
And from my point of view, I actually think my point of view is that it starts with parents, and that the responsibility, I believe, starts with parents. But I do believe that other institutions should have a vested interest. So whether it's schools, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's financial institutions, I think having better educated consumers around finance is best for all. So I don't believe it's the job of one particular entity, but I do believe it should start in the home with parents. As a parent myself, I think about it. I'm thinking, well, for me at least in my family, it's my responsibility, my wife's responsibility to start educating our children. But I also think there needs to be other ways for students, whatever age you are, and for adults to continually learn, right? We all learn, right? Whether you're in primary school or in university, or you're a young adult or whatever, right? Those are different stages of life. And I don't believe that financial education is static. I think it should continue to grow with us as humans as we grow and develop. So I think that's why I believe there are multiple sort of stages, and why I think multiple institutions should play a role in that and should have a vested interest in playing a role. But again, my perspective would be it starts with the parents and the family.
Absolutely. I think a couple of things I'll add from what you've said are that one of my worries is if you don't have lots of reliable sources for information, other things will fill that gap anyway. So, you see a lot of people telling you, don't get financial advice from TikTok. That's not where you should be getting it from. Okay, where is it then? Where else can I find it? And a lot of people are having this, they're turning to different sources. I'm sure there are some people on TikTok that know their stuff, but, they're turning to these maybe less reliable sources because they're not getting that information from school. They're not getting it from other places where they could be getting it. And I also think that, I attended an event with Shares, which is a social investing app recently, and it was around millennials and Gen Z and how people at the moment are really peer educating around things like investing and money, because, our parents who we'd normally get that advice from come from a totally different world where they're saying, well, why don't you just buy one of those £1,000 houses that I bought, and then it'll be worth 10, 20 times that amount in a few years, and that'll be fine. And it's just a different world that we need to start educating ourselves around, and we have different tools to be able to do that now, and to be able to, invest our money and save our money in different ways. And so it's about kind of keeping up with those changes, but making sure that you are, I suppose, filling those gaps so that people aren't going to unreliable sources at the same time. And another thing I would talk about is the idea of doing a formal course in something is really interesting. And Sandra, you kind of mentioned that around fintech. I think I sometimes wonder if I studied something for 3 years, it might be out of date then by the time I actually go and use it, because things are changing so quickly nowadays. There are so many innovations that, I hadn't even heard of a few years ago. And I think that certain people are more drawn to those academic courses than others. So I went to an International Women's Day event with Marketa actually at the start of this month. And a lot of one thing that all the women had in common was we all felt we needed some formal qualification to be able to talk about certain topics and to be able to have these discussions. And I'm sure lots of men feel like that as well, but it was certainly something that we all had in common there. And people are very convinced that they need to get some sort of certificate to be able to kind of speak on a panel or speak to their colleagues about things. Do we think there's a place for taking those courses, or do we think that we need more of a practical learning? Does anyone have any reflections on that?
I think there's a kind of mix of stuff that we could do. There are some good courses actually. I think Imperial do an 8-week course on payments, and I've looked at the syllabus and it looks pretty good, and some of the professors look very well qualified. So, and again, I think maybe it goes back to that point of people learn differently. Some people like to have instructor-led stuff, but I guess I don't know. This is also a kind of an issue in product management generally, because there's lots of people who've moved into product who are saying very similar things. They're saying, "Oh, I've done 5 years in product, but I feel like I should have a formal qualification."
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes there is no formal qualification that has that social validation that you could put on your CV, and everyone recognizes as, "Oh, okay, you're qualified." So I think it's just going through those experiences and making sure that, again, you're up to date with stuff and you research a topic before you start talking about it. But I do see the value in doing a course. It just needs to be a course that can be seen and it has a bit of that social validation with it, and has experts leading the course. I'm not sure that there are many of those out there.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of those short courses, absolutely valid. As an executive program, a lot of them are already high level. Like it's kind of like you're already at a certain level in your career and you want to take that step up, and you do that accelerated dive into fintech, blockchain, or whatever. From a learning perspective, of course, because this is a way of learning, why not? But I think the point you're making, where essentially having taken a certain course should work as an accreditation validation that you are suitable to do the job. For me, that's where probably there's a bit of a fine line, because majority of the people that I know, they're not coming from a payment school, right? I know people that come from payment school because there are countries that they do actually have like specific payment school, which I was surprised about. In France, you have that. You've got them in Switzerland as well. But the people that I know that are coming from the school are just not finding the relevance in the way they're operating with the skills that is needed in their job. So I have not yet met a person that is formally qualified as an engineering payments or whatever you call them, that find that the course prepared them for delivering the work they're doing today. So yeah, from learning, absolutely, but whether you should kind of have this as a validation check, or are you coming from an engineering and payment school to assess whether the person can do a job? I'm not 100% feeling that this environment lend itself to that, because it's just fast moving and it's on the job and it's use case based and it's vertical based, and
So, and just anecdotally, I totally agree. I did a 4-year computer science degree. Day one, my first job on a trading desk, and I didn't use any of the stuff I'd learned in my degree. Like some of the basic principles, but day one was, okay, build this thing, and I was like, I don't have a clue. Like, okay, I need to use some like process and some framework, but I didn't know the language they were asking me to write in. I didn't know it, so I had to kind of do some research and then practically apply it. So I totally agree with that if you're gonna, you can learn something and you can go on a course and have an instructor-led course, and I think maybe someone else said it in the comments as well, but if you're not, like French, if I learn French now but I never use it, I never go to France, within 6 months my French is going to be completely gone. And so you have to use the art as well.
Joe, do you have any point to add there? Okay.
Nope. It was all well said.
Yeah. I think there is. I think you're right. There is a fine line. I mean, no one wants to go into heart surgery and have the person say, "Hey, you know, I've listened to some podcasts. I've been kind of looking at it as I go here." So it does depend on the role in question, right? But I think it's really interesting, and I do think it's important for the industry and all companies that we kind of think about people's skills and backgrounds more holistically, and we don't just note it down to you've either got this or you haven't got this, or you've done this job before or you haven't. And I'd love to get all of your thoughts on how maybe improving and changing the way and doing things like Marquetta does, trying to, I suppose, demystify this environment. How do you think that can impact the kind of different diverse people that we get in these organizations, you know? And I mean, you know, not just around things like gender and ethnicity, but around people who come from a different industry and might have a different way of thinking or a different sort of educational background. Have any of you seen that impact so far, or what do you think, what kind of impact do you think it could have?
What I can say is, in my line of work, I'm seeing this a lot, because you would assume that the people that need the fundamental kind of, you know, induction into payments are the ones that are coming into the industry. And I'm pleasantly surprised to see that the reality of, say, people being expert in a vertical, you know, and having spent time in gaming or whatever you want to call it, and they just come into payments, they're relevant because they come with real insightful understanding, operational understanding of how that, you know, that space works, but they don't necessarily understand payment. And I'm seeing that they can be very senior, right? They can come to manage, you know, large infrastructure. So payment, the basics and the foundations of payment, it's not necessarily something that just is applicable for a newbie into the industry, right? I'm just seeing how relevant and important it is. Now, I feel that organization typically, and I don't know if other than payments are different, but of course I've been exposed a lot more to the corporate payment world. We generally have been so bad at capturing information. I mean, every single organization that I've gone through, you know, they just have certain initiative, like having an intranet or starting to build what Marketer is doing. It's absolutely phenomenal. But what's really key is to keep up consistently feeding that knowledge source. And I've seen a lot of launch in other corporates where it's a great start and then it just plateaus. That's all you get. You get one or two articles. So the organization themselves say they've been 15 years in, you know, issuing, in, you know, banking. They are the ones that should lay those grounds. So they should really dedicate a time to really make this a priority, right? There's a lot of L&D department across all of the different organizations, but at what point do they actually capture and build something that remain and will essentially sustain and support, you know, the need as new people come in, etc. So organizations in payments, generally, they just, I don't know if they don't see the value in it, but they absolutely don't invest or dedicate time in the way that I'm now happily seeing it when I saw the marketer guide. And it's been so well received. Why? Because others don't have that resource, right? That just tells you how much the industry is in need of being able to have a source where they could leverage that. And it would be good if every expert has that, because then it becomes a cross-sharing, you know, opportunity for everyone. It puts you in the picture in terms of that expert as a program manager, as a card issuer, as an acquirer. And it also enables, you know, that, you know, essentially insight to tag or to complement the knowledge that an acquirer is actually producing on whatever network or interchange or, you know, processing. Yeah, I think every players should really start looking from the inside out. Like, you have the opportunity to be that authority voice about how payment is done from an acquirer, from account management or whatever perspective.
I think just, I'm conscious of time, but I think there's one kind of buzzword maybe in fintech that's going to lead to, I think, more card education, more payments education, which is embedded finance. Because if you're embedding payments product into things that maybe traditionally don't have payments product embedded into them, you're going to have to, like, if you're a car dealer, you know the problems of car dealership interactions, and so that person is probably going to have to learn a bit more about payments to kind of have that kind of full ecosystem of payments being embedded into a car sale, or e-commerce, like small e-commerce sites knowing more about payments to understand which payment method to to kind of post on their site. So I think embedded finance is going to make that payments education even more valuable, which again is why Demystifying Cards project is a really key bit of work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Obviously, with MMOB, we even talk about, I guess, embedded services, because it goes beyond that finance and that payment side. And I think that kind of shows that we're not in a world where there's like the financial services industry or the fintech industry and then lots of other sectors. It's kind of, you've got that as a basis now for all these different sectors and companies. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. I know we could talk about this for a lot longer, but I really appreciate all of your time there. So I just want to say a big thank you to Joe from Visa, to Sandra from Paperwork, and to Jazz from Bitsel, and to Marketta for hosting the event as well, and to you all for listening and commenting in. So hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks all.